For years, the world listened to Whitney Houston's voice, but only when it sang what people wanted to hear. The high notes, the anthems, the perfection. What the world wasn't ready for was her truth. Behind the sold-out arenas and standing ovations, Whitney carried words she never sang on stage, thoughts she never shared in interviews, feelings that didn't fit into a headline or a hit record. And when she finally realized that silence was costing her more than honesty, everything began to change. This is the story of what Whitney Houston knew, but the world refused to hear. Not because it wasn't important, but because it was uncomfortable. What she was about to say challenged expectations, exposed hidden pressures, and revealed a side of her fame rarely acknowledged. And when she finally chose to speak, not with music, but with truth, the reaction would be impossible to undo. Stay with this story until the end, because what Whitney tried to say wasn't meant to please anyone. It was meant to save her. If stories like this move you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. I learned early that people didn't just listen to my voice, they listened to what they wanted it to mean. Every note I sang became a promise to someone else. Hope, strength, escape. And I carried those meanings carefully because disappointing people felt more dangerous than exhausting myself. From the outside, my life looked loud. Applause followed me everywhere. Cameras flashed. Rooms filled the moment I entered them. But inside, there was a quiet I didn't know how to explain. A kind of silence that settled in my chest long before I ever stopped singing. There were things I wanted to say that didn't belong in a song. I noticed it backstage one night, standing alone while the crowd chanted my name. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, and yet I felt strangely removed from it, like I was listening through a wall. My reflection stared back at me in the mirror, flawless under the lights, and I remember thinking, they know the voice. They don't know the woman. That realization frightened me more than any bad review ever could. People around me spoke constantly, managers, assistants, producers, but no one asked what I was carrying. And when they did, their questions came with limits. Be honest, but not too honest. Vulnerable, but not messy. Grateful. Always grateful. So I learned how to swallow words. I swallowed the days when the pressure made it hard to breathe. I swallowed the nights when success felt lonely instead of triumphant. I swallowed the confusion of being loved by millions and truly known by so few. Every time I tried to speak, I felt the invisible hand of expectation guiding me back into silence. This isn't the time, they'd say. People don't need that, they'd add. Just sing. Someone would always remind me. And so I did. But the things I didn't say didn't disappear. They gathered. They pressed against me during quiet moments, in hotel rooms, in cars after shows, in the early hours when sleep refused to come. I began to realize that silence wasn't neutral. It was doing something to me. There was one interview I'll never forget. The questions were light, predictable. Success, gratitude, future plans. At one point, the interviewer smiled and asked how it felt to be living the dream. The answer they wanted was easy. Instead, my chest tightened. For just a second, I considered telling the truth, that dreams can be heavy, that being admired doesn't always feel like being understood. I felt the words rising, urgent, and unfamiliar. And then I stopped myself. I smiled. I said what I was expected to say. And the moment passed. That night, alone again, I felt something crack. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a hairline fracture no one else could see. I realized how often I'd chosen comfort over honesty. Not my comfort, but everyone else's. I started to ask myself questions I had avoided for years. What happens when the voice isn't enough? When the applause doesn't quiet the unrest? When the truth doesn't fit the image? The scariest part wasn't that people might reject what I had to say. It was that they might never listen at all. I understood then that the world wasn't unprepared because my truth lacked value. It was unprepared because my truth challenged the version of me it depended on. And as long as I stayed silent, that version stayed intact. But silence was starting to feel like a betrayal, not of the audience, not of my career, but of myself. That night, Standing by the window, city lights flickering below, I whispered words I never said out loud before. They sounded small in the room, fragile and dangerous all at once. And in that moment, I knew something irreversible had begun. Because once you admit the truth to yourself, the hardest part isn't finding the courage to speak it. It's deciding whether you're ready to let the world hear what it's been avoiding all along. After that night, the quiet changed shape. It wasn't just absence anymore. It became a presence. I could feel it following me from room to room, sitting beside me in cars, waiting backstage while I adjusted my smile before stepping into the light. Silence had turned into a choice I was making every day, whether I admitted it or not. The more I noticed it, the heavier it felt. People assumed my calm meant control. They mistook composure for certainty. If I hesitated before answering a question, someone filled the space for me. If I looked tired, they blamed the schedule. No one considered that maybe the problem wasn't how much I was doing, but how little of myself I was allowed to bring with me. Rehearsals became mechanical. My voice still soared, still landed exactly where it was supposed to. Technically, nothing was wrong. But something inside me resisted the perfection everyone praised. Each flawless performance felt slightly disconnected, like I was watching myself from a distance. One afternoon, during a break, a producer joked, "You make this look easy." I smiled politely, but inside I felt the familiar tension. Easy had never been the right word. Controlled, maybe. Disciplined. But never easy. I wanted to say, "You don't see what it costs." Instead, I nodded. That was the moment I realized silence wasn't being forced on me anymore. I was participating in it. I had learned how to protect others from discomfort by minimizing my own. The system didn't need to silence me. I had internalized its rules. That realization was unsettling. I began to notice how often conversations stopped just short of honesty. How concern was offered, but only within safe boundaries. When I hinted at exhaustion or doubt, responses came quickly, polished, and dismissive. "You've been through worse. You're strong. This is what you were meant to do." Those words were meant to encourage, but they landed like walls. Strength, I learned, could be used to deny vulnerability just as easily as it could support it. One evening, after a long day, I sat alone and replayed an old recording of myself singing. Not a hit, not a polished take, but a rough rehearsal from years earlier. My voice wasn't perfect. There were breaks, moments of breathlessness, emotions spilling into the sound. I cried listening to it, not because it was beautiful, but because it was honest. I could hear myself inside the music in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. That version of me hadn't been afraid to be heard as human. It made me wonder when I decided that honesty was a liability. The pressure intensified subtly. Not with threats, but with reminders. Schedules packed tighter. Expectations raised higher. Silence rewarded with smooth operations and approval. I saw how speaking up would disrupt not just relationships, but entire systems that depended on my predictability. And yet, staying silent was starting to disrupt me. I began testing small truths in private conversations. Admitting I was tired without softening it. Saying I didn't know instead of offering reassurance. The reactions were mixed. Some people leaned in, surprised. Others shifted uncomfortably, eager to move on. It was then I understood something important. Not everyone wanted honesty. Some people needed my silence to remain intact. That knowledge hurt more than rejection ever could. Late one night, I wrote in my journal again. I didn't plan what I wrote. The words came quickly, almost urgently. I wrote about the cost of being palatable, about how my voice had been celebrated while my feelings were managed, about how dangerous it felt to imagine being heard without harmony to soften the truth. I closed the journal shaking, because acknowledging the problem meant facing the solution. And the solution wasn't a break, or a vacation, or another reinvention. It was a decision. Either I continued choosing silence, knowing exactly what it was doing to me, or I accepted that speaking would change how people saw me forever. As I turned off the light, one thought settled clearly in my mind. The world might not be ready to hear what I had to say, but I was no longer sure I could survive pretending that didn't matter. There was a night when everything lined up, the setting, the timing, the quiet pressure in my chest, and I almost said it. Not in a whisper, not in a journal, out loud, where it could no longer be taken back. It happened before a performance that mattered more than most. The venue was packed, the energy electric, the kind of night people later described as historic. Backstage buzzed with voices and movement, but inside me there was a strange stillness, like the pause before a storm decides whether to break. Someone knocked lightly on the door of my dressing room. 5 minutes, they said. I thanked them and turned back to the mirror. I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me, not because she looked different, but because she looked finished. Polished. Complete. As if there were nothing left to say. That frightened me. I sat down, hands resting on my knees, and felt the weight of everything I hadn't shared pressing upward. I thought about how many times I'd been told that my job was to inspire, not complicate. That honesty was fine as long as it didn't disrupt the fantasy. I wondered what would happen if I disrupted it anyway. Outside, the crowd roared louder. My name echoed through the walls. That sound had once fueled me. That night, it felt like a reminder of how many people were waiting for a version of me that didn't fully exist. I stood up and opened my mouth, not to sing, but to speak. Just to myself at first. The words came quickly, trembling with urgency. I'm tired. I'm grateful. I'm not okay in the way you think I am. They sounded dangerous. Powerful. True. For a brief moment, I imagined walking onto the stage and telling them everything before singing a single note. Not dramatically. Calmly. Letting the truth stand on its own, without melody to protect it. I imagined the silence that would follow. The confusion. The discomfort. And then I imagined the aftermath. Headlines stripped of nuance. Concern twisted into speculation. Truth repackaged as weakness. I had seen it happen to others. I knew how quickly honesty could be turned against you when people felt entitled to your image. The door knocked again. 1 minute. I felt the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. This wasn't about courage alone, it was about consequence. Once spoken, the truth couldn't be managed. It would belong to everyone. I picked up the microphone. The lights came up. The music began. My body moved on instinct, muscle memory guiding me forward. The crowd erupted, and just like that, the moment passed. I sang beautifully that night. People said it was one of my best performances. They described the emotion in my voice, the power, the connection. Some even said they felt something different. They were right, but not in the way they thought. What they felt wasn't revelation. It was restraint. The tension of words held back. The weight of a truth hovering just beneath the notes. Afterward, as applause thundered around me, I smiled and bowed and accepted praise. And inside I felt hollow. Not because the night had failed, but because I had. Backstage again, alone once more, I sat in the same chair I'd left hours earlier. The mirror reflected the same composed face. But now I could see the cost clearly. That was the night I realized something painful and necessary, waiting for the right moment. To speak was another form of silence. And silence, no matter how justified, always serves someone. Just not always the one keeping it. I didn't speak that night. But the near miss changed me. It proved that the truth wasn't fragile. I was. And fragility, I began to understand, wasn't something to hide. It was something I would eventually have to honor, even if the world wasn't ready. Because once you almost tell the truth, pretending it doesn't exist becomes unbearable. And I knew then that another moment was coming. One where staying silent would no longer be an option. After that night, something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not all at once, but in quiet, relentless ways. I began to notice how much energy it took just to maintain belief. Not faith in my talent, that part came easily. Belief in the story everyone told about me. The one that left no room for doubt, exhaustion, or contradiction. People often say fame isolates you. That's true. But what they don't tell you is how it isolates you, by surrounding you with certainty. Everyone around you knows exactly who you are supposed to be, and they are deeply invested in making sure you stay that way. I started hearing it in conversations that weren't meant to be cruel. You're so strong. You always pull through. You were born for this. Compliments, yes, but also expectations disguised as admiration. Strength became something I owed people, not something I could choose. On tour, nights blurred together. Hotels felt interchangeable. Applause became a rhythm rather than a response. And in between, I learned how to smile through questions that weren't really questions at all. They were confirmations, prompts for reassurance. Are you happy? Of course, I'd say. What keeps you grounded? My faith. My family. Each answer was true, but incomplete. Carefully edited. I gave them pieces that wouldn't scare them, fragments that fit the image they already trusted. Because belief, I learned, is fragile when it depends on perfection. There were moments when I tested the edges. A comment here, a hesitation there. I'd mention being tired, or overwhelmed, or unsure. The room would tighten instantly. Concern would appear on faces. Not concern for me, but for what my words might imply. That was the unspoken rule. Vulnerability was allowed only if it resolved quickly. Only if it ended with triumph. Struggle was acceptable as a backstory, never as a present tense. So I learned to compress myself. I became fluent in deflection, in turning pain into humor, in redirecting conversations back to gratitude and grace. People praised my honesty, unaware of how much I was leaving unsaid. What hurt most wasn't the silence, it was the praise that followed it. You're handling everything so well, they'd say. And I wondered what would happen if I didn't. Late one night, after a long stretch of performances, I sat alone in a hotel room with the lights off. The city glowed outside the window, distant and indifferent. I felt an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with fatigue. It was the ache of being known by millions and understood by almost no one. I thought about how belief had become a contract. They believed in my voice, my resilience, my joy. In return, I was expected to deliver them consistently. Any deviation felt like a breach. But belief built on silence has a cost. The more I protected the image, the further I drifted from myself. I began to feel like a translator between my inner life and the world, constantly deciding what could be safely shared and what had to remain hidden. And the hidden parts didn't disappear. They accumulated. They surfaced in quiet moments, in tears that came without warning, in a heaviness that no standing ovation could lift. I wasn't breaking, not yet, but I could feel the strain. That was when I understood something crucial. Being believed was not the same as being seen. And for the first time, I questioned whether the world truly loved me, or just the version of me that never asked too much. The realization didn't make me bitter. It made me careful. Careful with my words. Careful with my energy. Careful with myself. But care, when it becomes constant restraint, starts to feel like a cage. And cages, no matter how beautifully decorated, are still cages. I didn't know then how or when I would step outside of it. I only knew that continuing this way would cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. Not my career. My voice, the one no one was ready to hear yet. And I was getting tired of whispering it to myself. By the time I realized how quiet my inner world had become, I had already mastered the art of noise. I knew how to fill arenas, how to command a room, how to turn breath into something people would remember forever. But away from the lights, I struggled with a different kind of silence, the kind that follows you when no one is asking you to perform. I began to crave spaces where I didn't have to be impressive, where my voice could crack without consequence, where no one was listening for power or perfection, only truth. Those spaces were rare. Fame doesn't leave much room for anonymity, and honesty is risky when the world is always watching. Still, I searched. Sometimes it was late at night, sitting on the edge of a bed, humming softly just to remind myself that my voice belonged to me before it belonged to anyone else. Sometimes it was in conversations that stayed small and private, with people who didn't interrupt, didn't fix, didn't reframe my feelings into something more palatable. I learned how foreign that felt. I had spent so long being celebrated for certainty that I forgot how to sit with doubt. For years, every question directed at me came with an expectation of wisdom, of clarity, of inspiration. I was always supposed to know about music, about faith, about life. But there were days when I didn't know anything at all. And those were the days that scared me the most. I noticed how often I softened my own truths before speaking them. How instinctively I wrapped discomfort in reassurance. I would say, "I'm fine," when I meant, "I'm tired." I would say, "I'm grateful," when I meant, "I'm overwhelmed." I would say, "I'm blessed," when I meant, "I'm lonely." None of those statements were lies. But they weren't the whole story either. The applause had trained me well. It had taught me which parts of myself were welcome and which ones needed to stay backstage. It rewarded confidence and punished hesitation. It celebrated strength, but recoiled from ambiguity. And slowly, I began to understand something painful. Silence wasn't always imposed. Sometimes it was learned. There was a moment, small, unremarkable to anyone else, that stayed with me. I was in a room full of people who cared about me, people who meant well. Someone asked how I was really doing, the kind of question that invites honesty. I opened my mouth and closed it again, because in that split second, I weighed the cost of truth. I imagined the concern, the questions, the panic it might trigger. I imagined the headlines, the interpretations, the worry dressed up as protection. So I smiled instead. That night, I realized how deeply applause had shaped my instincts. It had taught me to measure myself by reaction, to speak only when my words landed safely, to equate being loved with being understood, even when the understanding was incomplete. I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to be heard, not for my range or my power, but for my humanity. The first time I truly tried to speak without applause, it felt terrifying. There was no stage, no microphone, no guarantee of acceptance. Just words offered without armor. They didn't come out beautifully. They weren't eloquent or inspiring. They were messy, halting, real. And nothing collapsed. The world didn't end. The image didn't shatter instantly. What did happen was quieter, a subtle shift inside me, a sense of relief, of alignment, of standing in my own life instead of performing it. I learned that speaking honestly doesn't always bring understanding. Sometimes it brings discomfort. Sometimes it brings distance. But it also brings integrity, and I was starving for that. Applause is powerful. It can lift you, sustain you, make you feel invincible. But it can also teach you to edit yourself until you forget what your unedited voice sounds like. I was beginning to remember. And once you hear yourself clearly again, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't. There comes a moment when silence stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like a mirror. It doesn't applaud you. It doesn't interrupt. It simply reflects what's left when everything else steps away. That was where I found myself. Not at the height of a note, not beneath the glare of stage lights, but in the quiet after the world had finished expecting something from me. In that quiet, I began to understand how much of my life had been shaped by anticipation, not my own, but everyone else's. People often think the hardest part of fame is being seen too much. But sometimes, the deeper struggle is never being seen enough. Being recognized without being known. Loved for what you give, not for who you are when you have nothing left to offer. For years, I had been surrounded by voices telling me who I was supposed to be. Strong, faithful, unbreakable, grateful. Those words weren't false, but they were incomplete. And living inside an incomplete version of yourself is a quiet kind of exhaustion. In the stillness, I began asking questions I had avoided for a long time. Who am I when I am not needed? What do I believe when I am not reassuring anyone? What does my voice sound like when I am not trying to carry the weight of hope for millions? The answers didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, unevenly, like learning a new melody after years of singing the same song. Some days, the silence felt peaceful. Other days, it felt unbearably loud. But it was honest. I started to see that perfection had never protected me the way I thought it had. It hadn't saved me from pain or confusion or loneliness. It had only delayed my confrontation with them. Letting go of that perfection didn't make me weaker, it made me available to myself. There was grief in that realization. Grief for the years spent editing my truth. Grief for the conversations I never had. Grief for the parts of me that learned to whisper instead of speak. But there was also freedom. I no longer needed to explain everything. I no longer needed to translate my pain into something inspirational. I could sit with it, name it, and let it exist without a lesson attached. That was new. I understood then that my voice had always been powerful, not because it soared, but because it carried feeling. And feeling doesn't disappear when the singing stops. It changes shape. It becomes presence. It becomes choice. The world may remember the performances, the notes that seemed impossible, the moments that felt larger than life. But what mattered most to me was quieter. It was the courage to be unfinished, the courage to be uncertain, the courage to let my humanity speak, even when it didn't sound heroic. I didn't stop loving music. I didn't stop loving the connection it brought. But I stopped confusing applause with truth. I stopped measuring my worth by reaction. I stopped believing that silence meant failure. Sometimes, silence is where you finally hear yourself clearly. And once you do, you carry that sound with you into every room, every conversation, every choice. Not as a performance, but as a grounding, a reminder. When no one is ready to hear what you have to say, you can still speak it. When the world is loud, you can still be honest. When the noise fades, what remains is not the image they built, but the self you chose to keep. And that, at last, was enough.